Welcome to the Deep Dive. We've got your stack of sources right here, all focused on, well, a really fascinating country, Costa Rica.
Yeah, it definitely stands out. And when most people hear Costa Rica, they probably think, Switzerland of Central America. Right?
Exactly. And your sources lay out why, peace, stability, no army, social welfare, relatively high living standards. It's quite the image.
It is a reputation. It's definitely earned in many ways. But what jumps out immediately from digging into these sources is that, well, it's more complicated than that.
Right.
It's not some perfect paradise. The sources talk about real contemporary problems, things like a sluggish economy, corruption issues, transportation limits, bureaucracy.
So not just the postcard image.
Not at all. And even things like dependency on U.S. foreign policy, some rural human rights concerns. The stability is there, but it's, facing pressures.
Right. So the nickname tells part of the story, but maybe not the whole story. So our mission today is to really dive into these materials you sent over. We want to unpack how Costa Rica developed this unique profile, understand the path it took, and also get a handle on the challenges it's dealing with now.
And for you, the listener, the idea is you'll get a quick but thorough understanding. Go beyond that surface reputation. Find those aha moments about why it's so different from its neighbors.
Okay, so where does this story begin? Let's go right back, before Columbus. What do the sources tell us about the really early roots?
Well, the archaeology suggests people were there maybe as early as 10,000 BC, which is quite far back.
Wow.
And by around 3000 BC, you've got settled agricultural societies starting to form.
Was it just one group of people, or?
Actually, no. The sources point to two main language families. You had Chibchen speakers, mostly north of the Rio San Juan area, Limon Bay.
Okay.
And then Maipuran speakers south of there in an area the Spanish later called Baruca around 1560.
And how did these cultures change over time before the Europeans arrived?
Archaeologists break it down into three main periods. There's the pre-ceramic, that's like 11,000 to 500 BC. People moving from stone tools, hunting, gathering.
Toward something more settled.
Exactly, using fruit, roots, fish, small game. Then the ceramic period, 500 BC up to 1522 AD. That's when you see proper settlements, houses made of, clay, cane, timber, thatch.
Little villages.
Yeah, small villages, maybe 10 houses or so called jacales. And then, of course, the post-conquest period starts after 1522.
Now, the population size right before the Spanish came, the sources seem to have different numbers.
Yeah, estimates vary quite a bit, anywhere from 60,000 up to maybe 400,000. But the ethnological studies tend to land around 67,000 people, mostly Chibchen speakers.
Okay.
But the really critical point, and it's tragic, is how quickly they vanished after European contact.
Diseases, mainly.
Primarily diseases they had no immunity to, yeah. And also major changes to their environment. It's a pattern seen across the Americas.
Such a devastating impact.
Yeah.
How did the sort of structure of these indigenous societies affect how the Spanish colonized the area compared to somewhere like Mexico with the Aztecs?
That's a really key insight from the sources. Because there wasn't a massive centralized empire like Tenochtitlan or a huge, dense population.
Right.
The Spanish process of extraction was, well, simpler in a way. There wasn't a giant state to conquer or a massive labor force to immediately exploit on that same scale.
So they settled more gradually.
Yes, the farming conditions were good, so gradual settlement was possible. But this early reliance on just a few high-value crops, the sources note this was pretty precarious. It kind of plants a seed for later economic vulnerabilities.
Interesting. The sources even use this phrase, like this early setup contained the genesis of the incompatibility of a centralized state and transnational economies. Sounds complex.
It is. It suggests this vulnerability to outside economic forces goes way, way back. It helps frame why things developed the way they did later on.
Okay, let's talk about those outside forces. The Spanish arrive, early 1500s.
They're coming from the Caribbean, basically following rumors of gold in Central America, looking for wealth, looking for labor. The usual story.
Columbus himself landed there in 1502 on the Caribbean side.
He did. But here's the irony. Despite naming it Costa Rica, rich coast.
Yeah.
He and the others who followed actually described it as a poor land.
Huh. So the name didn't match the reality they found. Why? Were the rumors just wrong?
Well, partly. Unlike Mexico or Peru, they didn't stumble upon a massive gold-filled empire right away. They often stuck to the easier coastal routes, maybe avoided tougher areas inland with more powerful chiefdoms.
Okay.
And this approach also meant, according to the sources, that their documentation of the nature and the full extent of the land was, well, pretty inadequate.
So no quick riches. Where did they eventually set up a permanent base?
Cartago, founded in 1563. It was meant to be the main hub for settlement, and it's still the oldest town there today.
And the Spanish brought their system with them, the encomienda.
Oh, yes. Conquistadors got land grants and rights to the indigenous people living there on paper anyway. They demanded tribute, labor.
Justified as bringing civilization and God.
That was the justification, yeah. But the sources are pretty blunt, the reality. Non-compliance often meant annihilation, and they'd force indigenous people into these consolidated towns to control labor and tribute. It was often brutal.
And this is happening right as the indigenous population is plummeting from disease in the mid to late 1500s.
Exactly, which created a huge labor problem for the Spanish themselves. They tried pushing into the Central Valley around 1569, 1570.
Good farmland, you'd think.
You would. But they ran into really stiff indigenous resistance, plus food shortages. They actually gave up on the area pretty quickly. Spanish influence really pulled back by the late 1580s, early 1590s. Major settlement efforts were basically abandoned by 1591.
Wow, so this leads to Costa Rica being somewhat isolated.
Very much so. The sources say it was practically cut off from regular contact with the West from about 1560 onwards. The population grew incredibly slowly, only just over 30,000 people by 1800.
And that isolation, paradoxically, ends up being really important later on.
Hugely important, because it was relatively isolated and, frankly, not seen as strategically vital by Spain compared to other colonies.
Right.
It was largely spared the massive, destructive independence wars that ripped through places like Mexico or South America in the early 1800s.
So it could take a different path.
Yeah, the sources talk about it, allowing Costa Rica to sort of preach moderation and patience. It came out of that whole 30-year period of turmoil after 1821 practically unscathed, even with a few small internal flare-ups.
What a contrast to its neighbors. And they took an early step constitutionally.
Yes, the first constitution in 1841. And significantly, it included the decision to abolish slavery, laying down some markers early on.
Okay, so independence itself, declared September 15th, 1821.
Right. The act was signed up in Guatemala, the regional capital, and then the news filtered down to Costa Rica.
Big party. Parades.
Actually, no. It's interesting. The sources highlight that there wasn't some huge public eruption of joy right away. Apparently, the news initially gathered few fans.
Really?
Yeah, just small celebrations later in the day. The mood seems to have shifted more like a year later, September 1822, when news about the Mexican army being nearby arrived. Maybe the reality sunk in then.
Uncertainty makes sense.
Oh.
Okay, this brings us to Costa Rica's really distinctive democratic history. You compare it to its neighbors, lots of instability, dictatorships, but Costa Rica seems different.
It really is. That's a major theme in your sources. It's seen as one of the oldest, most stable democracies in the developing world. Critically, it's mostly avoided major civil war and political repression since 1948.
And the political system itself functioning for a long time.
Yeah, competitive elections for over a century, over 98 years just in the 20th century. And like 40 years of what political scientists call full democracy from the late 50s onwards. Presidents, legislators, local councils decided by vote since the mid-1800s.
And the sources make an interesting point about what people fought about politically.
Right. It says the competition was often about, which party was corrupt or which party seemed hostile to powerful groups.
Rather than fighting about the system itself.
Exactly. Less about challenging the fundamental democratic rules, more about who should run it. It suggests a kind of underlying agreement on the basics, even when politics got nasty.
Were there bumps in the road? Authoritarian moments?
Oh, sure. Brief periods of authoritarian rule or violence did happen. But the key thing the sources emphasize is that civil society consistently pushed back. And remarkably, only one president has ever actually been overthrown picado in that 1948 Civil War.
We definitely need to talk about 1948. But first, sticking with constitutions, that 1848 one described as lengthy and cumbersome.
78 articles. Covered a lot. Religion, church-state stuff, elections, powers of president, senators, deputies, justice, civil rights. Quite detailed.
Any really specific or surprising clauses in there?
A couple stand out in the source analysis, like a ban on treaties that would limit trade freedom.
Interesting.
And Congress couldn't just delegate the power to set import-export duties to the president. Had to be done through law. Article 74, no taxes without a legal basis. Very explicit.
How is power balanced? Or unbalanced?
Pretty unbalanced, actually. Favored the executive, the president. They could call special sessions of the legislature, only they could propose laws initially, and they had veto power.
But the sources also call it a hybrid. What does that mean?
Well, while the structure looked Republican, some aspects felt almost monarchical. The way the president could delegate authority to secretaries, the sources liken it to how kings used royal ordinances.
A legacy of President Delarine, and the takeaway from the sources on this constitution.
Basically, that if a constitution is too long and detailed, it risks becoming an inexecutable political program. Hard to actually put into practice effectively.
Makes sense. Okay, let's shift gears to the economy. What really drove things after independence? Cash crops, right? Coffee, bananas.
Absolutely central. The focus went straight to exports. Coffee was even mentioned as important in early constitutions, 1825, 1856. Production just exploded, became the main product, hands down.
Where did they grow it mostly?
On the wetter volcanic slopes, basically. Rich soil, needed shade too, specific conditions. Exports started early, and trade with the U.S. was significant by 1850. They built infrastructure for it, harbors like Carrillo in 1845, roads.
And this was the golden years of coffee.
That's what the sources call it. Huge expansion. Settlement pushed west, often displacing smaller farmers. A new coffee elite got very wealthy.
And that wealth funded more development.
Yep. Railways to the Pacific, ports like Capos, Port Lemon, Alajuela, all tied into getting that coffee out.
Then came the bananas.
Right. Banana cultivation for export really took off in the humid lowlands, starting in the 1870s. And the big name here is Minor Keith. His operations eventually became part of the infamous United Fruit Company.
United Fruit, a giant in the region.
A sprawling behemoth, as the sources put it, immensely powerful. They controlled everything growing, processing, packing, shipping.
And the sources mentioned their treatment of workers.
Yeah, this is where your materials include some, frankly, disturbing details. Unjust payments are mentioned. But then it explicitly states that between 1940 and 1944, on average, a worker was beaten to death every year by company thugs.
Every year. That's horrific.
It is, and the sources even mention instances of bodies being dumped in the Caribbean Sea as a warning to other workers. It's a stark example of the power imbalance and brutality.
Really underscores the dark side of that economic boom.
Absolutely. Before 1961, you had these monopolies, Cenex for coffee, United Fruit for bananas, basically setting all the terms. And despite the national wealth these crops generated, the sources stress the huge inequalities. Pre-1961, something like half the national income went just to the heirs of these coffee and banana fortunes.
So prosperity, but very concentrated. How did that start to change? Did things become more equitable?
Well, there was a major economic shift after 1948, things like import substitution, trying to diversify agriculture in the 50s, moving away from just relying on one or two crops.
Needing broader markets.
Exactly. Needing foreign demand for more things. There was a big shock in 1973 related to coffee. They failed to meet an export quota, faced penalties, price hikes that pushed diversification even more.
Into what kind of new products?
More into like horticulture, blackberries, chrysanthemums, shorter cycles, higher value. But the sources note this also made them more dependent on things like imported fertilizers, pesticides, external inputs.
And the mid-'80s brought more economic headaches.
Yeah, there was a glut in the market for some of these new products, quality issues, even threats of trade retaliation from the U.S. This period also saw more unplanned urbanization, people migrating for seasonal work, rising debt. Environmental issues started getting tied into trade talks more explicitly around then, too.
But the late 80s.
Yeah.
That seems like a real turning point. A major pivot.
Huge pivot. The transformation really speeds up. By 1993, coffee and bananas are down to only about a third of exports.
So what replaced them?
Non-traditional farm products, yes, but also light manufacturing and, crucially, sophisticated computer components.
That electronics boom was incredible. The sources say, what, from zero exports in '86 to being the largest exporter of electronic components to the U.S. by '91? $850 million?
It's an astonishingly rapid shift, and right alongside that, tourism exploded. By 2000, Costa Rica is a major global destination. Tourism brought in about a fifth of all export earnings.
What did all this economic change mean for ordinary people? Poverty, inequality.
Big impacts. The share of people working in agriculture dropped massively, 41% in '81 down to 20% by 2000. And this shift came with real social gains. Poverty rates fell sharply, from around 50% down to 21%. Income inequality, the Gini index, also went down.
That's significant progress.
Yeah.
It sounds like those economic shifts really did lift a lot of boats. Okay, let's zero in on that absolutely critical moment. The 1948 Civil War. You mentioned turmoil peaked then.
It did. The war itself was short, March 12th to April 19th, 1948.
What led up to it? What was the context?
It's that post-World War II period, right? Lots of social and political change happening globally, U.S. influence expanding, leftist movements emerging.
And domestically.
The Calderon government from 44 to 48 had passed these historical social reforms, important stuff. But the sources argue they had flaws, omissions, didn't fully resolve the underlying discontent.
So tensions were high.
Very high. Lots of labor unrest. There was a big strike in July 47, the Strike of Arms Down, which the sources call a major struggle of classes. And then the 1948 election was disputed. That, according to the sources, was the breeding ground that finally sparked the war.
And the opposition, led by José Figueres Ferrer, won. What happened next, particularly to those on the losing side or in the labor movement?
The sources used the term brutal persecution against the labor and popular movements after the war ended.
But paradoxically, even with that happening, those social reforms that Calderon had started, they mostly went forward and were seen as a positive step.
Yes, that's the complex picture the sources paint. Repression of certain groups, but the progressive social agenda itself continued and expanded. It was seen as a qualitative leap in quality of life. But the biggest, most defining outcome of 1948.
The abolition of the army.
Exactly. Abolished in 1948, written into the 1949 Constitution, Article 1, first country in the world to do it.
A kind of social contract, the sources suggest.
Yeah, like the state gives up armed power in return for democracy, independence, neutrality. And it wasn't just policy. The sources say this idea of neutrality was consciously embedded in the population, in the leaders. It became part of the identity.
And this is crucial, no army didn't mean no violence at all.
Right. This is a really important nuance from your sources. They're very clear. A different kind of violence emerged. Not war between factions, but systematic oppression targeting specific groups based on race, sex, politics, economics.
The sources provide a stark example.
They do. They point directly to the decades of socioeconomic restrictions and dehumanization faced by the Black population imposed by the Latino white elite. And they even note this history is reflected in murals inside the National Theater.
Wow. That really complicates the simple narrative of peace and equality after 48.
It's a vital part of the story the sources make sure isn't overlooked.
Okay, moving beyond the immediate aftermath of the war, let's look at the broader social reforms and development push.
Right. After the 1949 Constitution was approved, making San Jose the official capital, there was a huge expansion of public services from about 1950 on.
Like education.
Massive focus on education. Building elementary schools everywhere, rural, urban. The goal was access for every child, plus setting up schools for industrial agriculture, cattle raising in the provinces.
And the University of Costa Rica played a big role.
Huge role. It had been recreated around 1940, and the sources really highlight it as a driving force for cultural and educational development, modernization, intellectual life.
And these reforms paid off in terms of equality. You mentioned the Gini coefficient earlier.
Yeah, during the peak years, Costa Rica compared favorably even to richer Latin American countries in terms of income distribution. But by the 90s, things got trickier. Questions arose about funding the social agenda, whether it was too pro-poor as state finances tightened.
Did quality suffer?
Well, later on, school enrollment rates dipped a bit. Health coverage stayed broad, but got fragmented across different public bodies. And while schools popped up everywhere rurally, quality could be uneven, sometimes favoring wealthier areas. Higher education quality got linked more closely to economic growth. Health, though, mostly kept its broad reach across classes.
Interesting how the roots of things like Social Security go back even further.
They do, back to the early 20th century. Popular movements, artisans organizing in mutual aid societies, unions.
That 1920 strike for the 8-hour day.
Exactly. Called out in the sources as a key struggle of classes. And these demands intercepted with other interests, like opposition to certain labor practices on railways and banana plantations. It was complex. But this pressure from below against poverty pushed for constitutional changes even back then, expanding rights for the poor, so the later safety net had deep roots.
Let's loop back to that no army policy. How did it play out in foreign relations?
Well, the U.S. actually liked the policy, especially during the Cold War. They provided aid, saw Costa Rica as a stable, democratic foothold in a turbulent region.
But your sources include a really striking, controversial point from 1980 about this relationship.
Yes, they do. The sources state quite directly that in 1980, connections between acquainted army, law enforcement agencies, and industrial complexes made Costa Rica a powerful actor in illicit trafficking, which jeopardized a genuine democracy.
That's a heavy claim. Illicit trafficking linked to security forces and U.S. connections.
It's presented factually in your materials, yes. A very complex and troubling picture. The sources also bring up later examples, like Costa Rica campaigning against Nicaragua internationally, inspecting fuel trucks, and a big cocaine seizure in 2008 involving a Costa Rican registered ship. These details definitely complicate the simple image of peaceful neutrality.
Okay, shifting to the official neutrality policy itself. That dates back to WWII.
President Figueres declared it 1941-43. Initially, there was resistance to joining the war, remembering difficulties from WWI. Neutrality was seen as staying out of it.
But they did get involved eventually.
Yeah, after a German sub sank a U.S. merchant ship near Honduras, Costa Rica was drawn into the war.
And relations with neighbors like Nicaragua, peaceful mostly.
Generally, yeah. Peaceful coexistence has been the norm, but there have been occasional flare-ups, border skirmishes, often with Nicaragua over river rights or territory.
There was some optimism in '79, though.
Yes. When the Somoza regime fell in Nicaragua and the Sandinistas came in, the sources initially described them as a leftist reform movement, and there was hope for better relations.
And Costa Rica hosted a regional peace conference.
The Inter-American Conference in San Jose in 1984 focused on peace, development, democracy, arms control. They proposed a regional monitoring body. Some agreed, but Nicaragua rejected it.
Did the conflicts in neighboring countries affect Costa Rica's view of the region?
Profoundly, according to the sources. The civil wars, the human rights abuses in Nicaragua, El Salvador, often fueled by outside intervention. It led to deep disillusionment in Costa Rica.
How so?
It boosted Costa Rican nationalism, a fear of getting dragged into conflict. That earlier sense of Central American brotherhood kind of faded. What used to feel like a second home for some Costa Ricans became a source of anxiety.
Okay, let's shift to something often celebrated. Costa Rica's environment. Conservation, sustainable tourism.
It's truly a standout feature. A tropical laboratory, an artist's park, tiny country, 0.03% of the Earth's surface, but holds maybe 0.5% of all species, something like 120,000 species estimated. It's incredible biodiversity.
But it wasn't always pristine, right? There was deforestation.
Oh, yes. The sources are clear about that.
Yeah.
Huge forest loss over the last century, down from maybe 80% cover to 40%. Agricultural expansion, fires, led to soil degradation, erosion in many places.
But then a strong conservation ethic emerged.
Very strong. The sources talk about a real environmental conscience, a respect for nature among Costa Ricans. Nature is a home and a pride of motherland that, quote, captures it. Lots of effort put into protected areas, national parks, marine reserves, indigenous territories.
Seems deeper than just government policy.
Yeah, the sources suggest a kind of psychological and spiritual bond between people, and nature drives it. It's part of the national identity.
The sheer numbers are wild.
Yeah, all these different ecosystems, microclimates, 297 places designated wonders of the world, World Heritage sites like Cocos Island, parts of Tempisque Bay.
And it wasn't just the government acting.
No, private groups, individual citizens were crucial. And the sources also credit indigenous peoples' historical stewardship and even early settlers recognizing the need to preserve forests. Plus, institutions like INBio were set up specifically to study and find sustainable ways to use this biodiversity.
And this leads into the whole ecotourism phenomenon.
Exactly. Since the early 90s reforms, Costa Rica is seen as a global leader.
Ecotourism meaning?
Basically, tourism that tries to protect the environment and benefit local people. Respectful tourism. It's contrasted in the sources with unsustainable mass tourism that was starting to cause problems in the 80s, like congestion, pollution in popular spots like Arenal or Manuel Antonio, damaging the very thing people came to see.
So the focus now is different.
Yeah, the sources say the focus is on tourism that actively protects nature and communities, while also being a major source of income, a balancing act.
Let's bring it up to more recent times. The 21st century, politics, current challenges.
The 2013 election stands out. Luis Guillermo Solís from the PAC party won, which was a bit of a surprise. He won on things like integrity, anti-corruption.
A rejection of the old parties.
That's how the sources interpret it, yeah. Voters turning away from the traditional two-party system, fed up with past corruption.
But the PAC itself had a mix of messages. Change and continuity.
Right. That tension, plus the vote split in many ways, led to a more fragmented political system. The sources talk about more radicalized conflict, fewer clear alternatives, maybe a weakening of the traditional liberal constitutional setup.
And the economic crisis around 2014 didn't help.
No, that made things worse. Party splits, changes in identity, more emotional politics, rise of more extreme parties. The PACSEC government itself faced big hurdles: the economy, internal issues, unmet expectations. The party shrank in later elections.
So recent politics sounds quite fragmented, maybe less stable than the historical image.
More volatile, certainly. And economically, despite progress over the decades, there have been persistent challenges since around 2008.
Like what?
Growing public deficits, high public debt, that means higher interest payments, pressure for more taxes, and the sources suggest the economy hasn't fully adapted to the global shifts.
Do those older historical legacies still shape debates today?
Oh, absolutely. Things like universal suffrage from '49, that deep social consciousness, the church's historical role, they created a space where lots of different groups feel empowered to jump into policy debates.
Like environmental issues.
Definitely. Environmental concerns got fiercely debated around things like the CAFTA trade deal or big real estate projects. Activists got very good at framing their arguments,
How so?
using what the sources call ecosystem-based framing, arguing from a position of environmental legitimacy, not just protesting. And sometimes that approach successfully challenged purely economic arguments, especially for major projects.
Okay, lastly, let's touch on culture. Art, festivals, that connection to nature again.
Yeah, the culture seems really tied to the natural beauty, that artist's park idea. Early on, there were efforts to promote arts societies in the 1840s and Academy of Fine Arts by 1860.
Any key figures mentioned?
Vargas Calvo, Carmen Lyra, names like that pop up. And the period around 1940 is highlighted again as a big cultural rebirth, literature, art, partly thanks to the reestablished university.
And the people. The sources describe them as warm, enjoying life.
Warm and friendly people who enjoy life, yeah. And they know how to party, apparently. The mix of cultures means lots of diverse, colorful festivals. It's a big part of life.
Catholic traditions are strong.
Rooted since the Spanish arrival, yes.
Yeah.
Parades, processions, especially for Holy Week. There's a specific tradition mentioned from Cartago, a special float made of sugarcane and things, blessed back in 1930. It's displayed, carried in procession, involves donations, real devotion.
Other kinds of festivities, too.
Oh, yeah. Parades with bands, clowns, fireworks. Folk traditions like the Fiesta de la Cruz, specific dances like the Danza de Champas, Danza de los Diablos. Lots of expression of local culture.
And it all seems to circle back to that connection between people and nature.
Yeah, the sources really emphasize that link between the peoplescape and the landscape, infused with nature, a love of purity, contributing to a fairly homogeneous sense of national identity.
Okay, so wrapping this all up, what a journey we've taken through your sources, from ancient settlements through colonialism, that unique democratic path, abolishing the army, major social changes, economic ups and downs, and this deep, deep connection to nature.
Right. And we've also seen the other side, the complexities your sources bring out, the economic strains, the recent political fragmentation, corruption concerns, the impact of outside forces, even those really difficult points about illicit activities and historical inequalities.
It's definitely way more nuanced than just Switzerland to Central America.
Absolutely. It's a country that deliberately built a unique path, but faces constant tests, both internal and external.
So it leaves us, and you the listener, with a pretty big question to think about, drawing on everything we've discussed from these sources.
Considering Costa Rica's history managing to build this stable democracy out of turmoil, making that radical choice about the military, prioritizing nature, what does its story tell us about how nations develop, how resilient they can be in our interconnected world with all its pressures?
Yeah, is that exceptionalism sustainable? What can we really learn from both its incredible successes and its very real ongoing struggles?
Something to definitely chew on.
A lot to ponder indeed. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.